It's the morning after the night before, and I'm catching up with events in the FTX Crypto Cup. We've just had day one of the semi-finals, and I'd like to take you through a little of what happened in the match between Teimour Radjabov and Magnus Carlsen. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting us via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find links down there in the description. So here we go. We're about to look at game 4 between Rajabov and Carlsen. First two games were drawn. Rajabov is a really solid player, a very practical player, and I think an excellent rapid play player. Carlsen is going to have to be on his best form in this match if he wants to get through. But after the first two drawn games, Carlsen did manage to win the third, a convincing positional squeeze. So this was game 4. Rajabov with white had to win this to tie the first set 2-all. A must-win situation for the 34-year-old Azerbaijani player. It's funny, Rajabov seems like he's been around for, years. Well, he has been. But he was a real prodigy when he started. He's so experienced. And yet, I was kind of amazed when I checked up. He's still only 34 years old. And as we know, a very, very strong player, having won the World Cup in 2 years ago, basically. Okay, here we go. It's a Ragozin played by Carlsen, which is a very respectable opening, a kind of Queen's Gambit. You put your pawn in the middle, you don't give away any territory. And Rajabov is, I would describe him as a very solid positional player, very good technical player, and that's what we see in this opening. He doesn't try to play something that's particularly wild. There are much wilder ways to play this. He goes for a positional advantage. So why did he check with the queen? Well, obviously he wasn't going to win that bishop because it's supported by the knight. But the point is to lure the knight to c6 where it blocks that c-pawn. Black often gets counterplay in these kind of Queen's Gambit positions with the pawn on d5 by advancing the c-pawn. But here, obviously, with the knight on c6, that's going to be difficult to arrange. And then rook c1. So one of the big ideas for white in this position is to put pressure on the c-file, making sure that knight can't move. And black has to find other ways to gain counterplay. So queen g6 from Carlsen, looking at the pawn on g2 and preventing the bishop coming to d3 as well. So all actually pretty regular so far. And here is where Rajabov starts to play in a very enterprising way. Remember, a must-win situation. He plays h4. Well, the advance of rook's pawns seems to be, the strategy of the moment over the past few years. Is this particularly outlandish? Well, actually, no. Why? Because white has a solid pawn centre, so you can actually get away with advancing at the side of the board. Is this some kind of wild attacking gesture? Actually, I don't think so. This is about gaining space on the kingside. And it's a very rare move, but in the games where it has been seen, as I said, it's more about gaining space and actually using that later on in the game. But yeah, it's a very, very interesting move, and things can turn out differently, as we're going to see here. So rook d8 from Carlsen looks pretty reasonable, supporting the pawn here, although it wasn't under fire. h5. And the queen comes to f6. Now, white can play this in various ways. You could simply drive the bishop back, or invite black to take on c3. But Rajabov continues to play in, well, a very enterprising way. Rook h4. Okay, so this is rather different from how this h-pawn advance has been seen in the past. You know, this rook perhaps looking to swing across to f4. But it's not absolutely clear what Rajabov wants with this move. What I find interesting now is that Carlsen, seeing this rook come up the board, seeks to punish Rajabov straight away by breaking with e5. And we'll see what happens in the game in a second. I just want to give you another variation before we look at the game. Have a look at this. So a very standard way for black of playing this position is to exchange and then play e5, which looks very reasonable when, you know, the rook is at the side of the board. Watch what can happen. Okay, this is a possible variation. And in this position, white has a fantastic move. Rook e4, using that rook at the side of the board. Of course, that shouldn't be taken because of this discovered check, and queen takes queen. But queen takes, and now rook e8 is actually a winning move, and bishop takes f7. So you can see how that rook move can be used tactically in this position as well. It's not just about, you know, gaining space. So it's complicated. Carlsen seeks to punish Rajabov by advancing in the center. Pawn takes pawn, rook takes, pawn takes pawn on e5. So watch out for the bishop here. So another point of this rook coming to the fourth rank. It's fascinating how this rook move actually comes in useful when the position opens up. So Carlsen exchanges first and then recaptures. But there's a problem with this. Rajabov is able to swoop down with the queen, and now we can see that that h-pawn really is very useful in this kind of position, because Carlsen always has to watch out for a check on this diagonal, which could be absolutely fatal given that g6 isn't ideal. So really interesting how, again, this cramping move h5 comes into play. In fact, Rajabov plays rook f4 here. The best move is actually rook d4, looking to get a huge check on this diagonal, and actually that works out very, very well for white. But rook f4 played also. I mean, this looks very plausible, also very tricky. The best move now is actually queen b6, and there are some crazy variations, but queen d6 played, bishop e2, and Carlsen simply has a problem here. So obviously bishop defends against the rook check, and actually white's king is relatively secure. You can see this nice shell around the king, and yeah, it's actually quite hard for black to attack. Carlsen's real problem, of course, is that it's very difficult to get the bishop and rook into play because of the queen. And here he plays f5, and I think that's kind of a reaction to, well, I mean, obviously he's worried about the pawn on f7, but it's not a beautiful move. Weakens the g6 square, but yeah, that's, I think, an indication that Carlsen has real problems in this position. And again, rook d4 is actually a good move here, but Rajabov goes for knight d4, also strong. I mean, looks like a very human move to attack this pawn. And c6 from Carlsen, but this is just very bad for black now. I mean, he should have tried queen b6, which is still quite tricky. Relies on white seeing this variation. And now rook d4. This move seems to be a key move in this position. That, you know, tactically this is not easy to see in a rapid play game. And the idea is this: that after this exchange, getting rid of that rook is actually very nice for white, because, you know, that's one of black's only active pieces, and you can see that this is absolutely horrible for black now. You know, the queen is the only piece in play, and well, black is losing basically. So knight d4 just played, c6, knight takes f5, and that is a clear extra pawn. And now we get to, you could say, the technical phase of the game. Rajabov is a pawn up. And again, we can see how useful it is to have this pawn on h5, cramping black's king. This is simply good positional chess. And one thing that is really important to remember in this endgame is this shell of pawns around white's king. Although this is the white's pawn majority in the position, and ultimately you want to advance these pawns, in fact it's a massive mistake to push them too early because that would weaken the king. Let's see how Rajabov plays, because he is a brilliant technician. This is his real forte. And let's see how he does it. So first of all, he's just keeping everything solid. That knight on a nice protected square. And he's using the rooks really well. Bishop d3, yeah. Threat here. King steps back and he exchanges. And now the next phase of the game. Like I said, if you try to push these too soon, then that gives black something to aim at. It would weaken the king. Tactically, it's more difficult. So instead, what you do, you have these two pawns here, and Rajabov conducts a minority attack against these three pawns. This is classic strategy. Carlsen has zero counterplay. That bishop is beautiful on g6 as well. Once again, we can see nice having the support of that pawn on h5. So here we go. This is the minority attack. What white is doing is attacking with these pawns, and that will isolate one of black's pawns on the queen side. No need to take that knight off. It's not doing anything because those pawns are solid. They protect the king, and that bishop is a strong piece. So here we go. It's the minority attack. So threatening a pawn here. Black exchanges. It's not just that a pawn is going to be isolated here. It also opens up lines for the rook as well. And I think Raja's play here is absolutely perfect. So Carlsen plays a6. It's really hard to suggest any improvements for black. You can see he has zero counterplay. And the rook comes in. Yeah, nasty for black. These pins. Knight f5. And the rook now goes after this isolated pawn. Well, black inevitably is losing a pawn there. So now it's two extra pawns. It looks like Carlsen is winning one back. In fact, he isn't, because after this, the knight has only one square. And then knight takes pawn, wins the pawn back, obviously. Pawn takes, rook takes, two extra pawns. Notice there is still this shell of pawns around the king. Zero counterplay for black. And now it's just a case of keeping everything solid and slowly trading down. Interesting, after the knight's adventure, what does it do? It comes back to that rock solid square. Everything protected. Raja plays this endgame perfectly. Really nice play. And rock solid again. I mentioned this in the last video, that this is like a Roman legion, with shields over their heads advancing slowly. And this is exactly the same. You keep a compact position. This is, well, absolute typical strategy in these kind of positions. And here, Carlsen resigned with two extra pawns. Of course, this is very, very easy for white. Perfect technique from Teimour Radjabov. So that meant that the first set was drawn 2-all. I'm not surprised that Carlsen is, well, I wouldn't say struggling against Rajabov, but he is not finding him an easy opponent. He is superb at rapid play. He's incredibly experienced. And, well, Carlsen is the favourite to win the match. However, if you get good odds on Rajabov, I think he's worth a bet. Not that I'm a betting man, but I think it's going to be very, very close in the next set. No doubt I'll be proved wrong. But anyway, let's see what happens. Thanks for watching.